Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to episode 369 of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations and Hugh Darnell's Strength and Conditioning. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course we do this across a range of different episodes: interest editions, expert editions, featured performers and coaches' corners. And on last week's episode, expert edition with Hugh Darnell, there was an introduction to our new co-host of the show, Huey. And on this week's episode, Hugh sat down with one of Australia's leading sports and exercise physiotherapists, Victor Popov, for an exploration of physio and performance insights. Victor has served as an exercise and sports physiotherapist across 3 Olympic cycles, Atlanta, Sydney and London. Victor has had extensive experience in cycling, having worked on the Tour de France and supported green jersey sprint champion Robbie McEwen, has worked at a multitude of international road and track cycling major events, has been involved with the QAS and Australian and international swimming teams, as well as the AFL, having performed work for the Brisbane Lions, Queensland Reds and AIS rugby programs. Now, Victor and physiotherapist Joe Brown and strength and conditioning coach Joey Hayes have an event coming up on the 30th of August 2025, Brisbane, Australia, titled High Performance Seminar. The space is still available for August the 30th's event, and you can jump over to ultimatesportsperformance.com.au to find out more or register for the event. For now, let's jump in with Hugh Darnell sitting down with Victor Popov on this expert edition, Physio and Performance Insights.
Today's guest is one of Australia's most respected sports physiotherapists, Victor Popov. He has a vast resume of working in elite sport, been to multiple Olympic Games, supported the Brisbane Lions as the head of physio in a golden era for the AFL team. He's also had the chance to support many of Australia's best endurance athletes in the Tour de France, some of the best cyclists we've been able to call our own. And more recently, in his private practice world, dived into a new style of treatment with neural engagement therapy and training, which I'm really excited to dive more into today. Yeah, some of those athletes include one of the greatest swimmers Australia's ever had, Susie O'Neill, Jason Ackermanis with the Brisbane Lions, and then guys like Susie O'Neill and Robbie McEwen, who has actually devoted a whole book chapter to Victor and credits a lot of his success in staying injury-free or getting back to performance to Victor. So I'm really excited to welcome Victor Popov to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks, Hugh. It's great to be here.
Vic, I've had the pleasure of working pretty closely alongside a guy like yourself, and I've got a lot of respect for your open-mindedness in having this old wisdom and incorporating a lot of different treatment methodologies, but with cutting-edge sports science and really getting the best out of your athletes. So for people who aren't familiar with you and what you have done, would you mind sharing a little bit of your backstory and how you've got to where you are today?
Yeah, interestingly, I went to my 40-year reunion graduation about a month ago. So for 40 years, I've been banging around the sports physio world. I was fortunate enough to get my first job out of uni at a sports medicine clinic in Sydney under Dr. Jenny Saunders. And that was really the start of where I got the passion for sports physio. There was Jenny Saunders, Grace Bryant, Nathan Gibbs were the docs. Peter Stanton and Graham Van Cam were the physios. Phil Vasily was a podiatrist. It was a pretty elite group of practitioners. And that's where I got the idea that a multidisciplinary approach to treating athletes was the way to go. And from there, I moved back to Brisbane to UQ, St. Lucia Sports and Rehab, and I'll probably get lost along the way, but I did some stints at the AIS as a locum early in the days, in the late 80s, and then jumped on board with Cam Lillycrap and created Chandler Sports and Rehab, and Peter Stanton came from Canberra from the Institute, and we got into Agilitas Sports and Rehab at Centenary, and then moved into the Brisbane Lions facility at the Gabba, where I have been to this day since the year 2000. My journey's involved working with some great people I've had great coaches, great athletes, great therapists, great teachers. So what I can contribute to athletes' performance comes from a broad, I guess, base of knowledge. And I've always been unafraid to look sideways or around the corners and see what else is around there. Because, again, I have the belief that there is so much out there that's good, and understanding what is good and differentiating what is good and bad through both experience and analysis is a really important thing to do. I've looked at alternative therapies. I work like an osteopath, sometimes more like a physio. I refer to acupuncture regularly. Functional medicine is something I have a strong belief in. I work with a German-trained naturopath doctor called Michael Artman, who is a Beachmont Natural Therapies Clinic. And Michael and I work together with athletes to create a more holistic approach. It's been great to work with guys like yourself and Dane Larson and others to sort of look at that whole approach of, it's not just physio and it's not just S&C, it's an integration of different systems and therapies and working out how to get a good outcome for your athlete. Along the way, I've also worked at a number of Olympic Games for Australia, Barcelona, Sydney, Atlanta, wrong sequence there. And for a couple of years I worked for the Russian Olympic Federation. The last Olympic Games were allowed to compete as a nation back in London in 2012. And that was through a good friend of mine, Heiko Solzwiel, who was running the cycling program for Russia. So I managed to loop in there and had some interesting experiences running a clean program in that environment. Certainly, I've been lucky to also work with GB cycling, endurance cycling, GB swimming. Other than the athletes that you've mentioned there, I worked very closely with Sam Riley and Shane Watson through their careers. And recently, Chelsea Hodges is an Olympic medalist in swimming. And again, I always find that my best outcomes are integrating with other professionals and coaches. I think coaches are the cutting edge of the performance level of the athlete. So, I've had some really great experiences with coaches. Heiko, who I mentioned, who passed away not that long ago, Gennady Turetsky, Scotty Volkers, Lee Matthews from the Lions was an amazing coach to work with, an amazing people manager. Then there's the various cycling coaches that I work with and sports scientists, Tim Kerrison, Dave Martin. I could list a range of people who've influenced both my approach to treating and who've facilitated my knowledge base. And I guess that's what comes with experience and working with good people.
Just as you're rattling off those names, they're probably the people within each of those silos that probably shape that whole industry. And so to come through and have that wide fabric of kind of experiences and learnings seems to have shaped you to be, the clinician you are today. And like I lost track of the number of sports you just mentioned, but it's clear that you've worked with some very impressive athletes and people. As a physiotherapist, what is your role in assisting these, special athletes and teams? Let's go to that one first, if you don't mind.
I think that role varies depending on where you're at. Obviously, in the Brisbane Lions structure, where Peter Stanton and I came in under Lee Matthews in 99 and were given carte blanche to do what we needed to do to bring that team from last and, in fact, winning 3 premierships in a few years. And we applied, high-level sports medicine practice to a sport that I think when we first turned up, there's still slabs of beer on the floor after the game and soft drink, and that changed with us. There had been a bit of heavy sports science in AFL in Adelaide a few years before that, where they'd won a couple of premierships back-to-back. My role varies. In that circumstance, it was a pretty heavily involved role where Peter and I, every 2 years, would take the role of director of medicine. So we'd facilitate a lot of what was happening, treatment and recovery sense. On Tour de France with Robbie, I'd turn up and integrate into the massage team. The first Tour de France I did, I was a soigneur rather than a physio. And a soigneur, for those that don't know cycling, is the guy that makes the sandwiches, massages the legs, drives the car, hangs out the feed bags to the riders. So I took that opportunity because I loved the sport and it was a way in. By my last Tour de France, I had my own room and I was considered to be a high-level practitioner. And so my role evolved in that sport. Certainly other individuals like Shane Watson, I travelled with Shane outside of the Australian cricket environment, and I had discussions with the coaches and other staff and integrated his sort of management. And that sort of evolved from a funny circumstance where Shane dropped on my doorstep in 2009, pretty much washed up according to the personnel involved, and do what you can with him sort of thing. And we developed a good process and relationship, and he ended up not playing cricket for a couple of years, and I digress a little bit with the story, but I remember sitting in Adelaide, because whenever I travelled to Adelaide to work on cycling teams, Shane O'Neill would come down and do his coaching and training, whatever he's doing. And we were sitting there in the Adelaide market having a coffee. And if anyone hasn't been to the Adelaide market, it's an awesome place to visit. And he said to me, Vic, I think I'm ready to play. I said, I think you are too, but where do we start? In your club, Shield? He said, there's this interesting tournament I've been invited to. I said, what's that? It's called the IPL. I said, never heard of it. It's 2020. Oh, perfect. You only have to bowl 4 overs and you can, it's limited time batting. Great way to start. And I think he signed as one of the cheapest players for that first IPL and one player of the tournament with Rajasthan Royals. And my role there was, again, to liaise with John Gloucester, who was the Rajasthan Royal physio, and say, hey, listen, here's what I was capable of. And that sort of was how that worked. And that then involved, when Shane got back into playing for Australia, I was living in Monaco working for cycling teams and flicking across for an Ashes series. And every morning before the start of the first day, I'd sit with the coach, Nielsen, and Ricky Ponting, the skipper, and they'd say, what's Warren capable of? I reckon he can bowl 10 or 12 overs a day or 20 overs or, whatever. That role varies depending on who I'm working with. Again, I can bounce around, and I had a really good relationship with Scotty Volkers on pool deck, where I'd go down pool deck and just watch, learn what he was doing with his athletes and looking. Scotty used to for his whole career, kept a diary of every training session that Sam Riley and Susie O'Neill and Ellie Overton and Jade Winter and a whole bunch of his athletes did. And we could go back and say, what happened here? What was the previous month of load? And it was quite funny. Back in those days, strength and conditioning didn't exist in swimming. I remember Susie's coach at the time was a guy called Bernie Wakefield. And I remember, and I've still got it at home because I pulled it out of a drawer the other day. It was a handwritten letter, because there's no computers back in those days, a handwritten letter explaining to Bernie why Susie should actually train with weights. Because Bernie just didn't believe in that. It was, he was old school, did a fantastic job with her. Susie eventually changed over to Scotty just because he had a different approach, and she evolved as an athlete with him. But my role on pool deck with Scotty was to be challenged. He'd say to me, what's going on? She's missing a session, he's missing a session. What's happening with that? And so I'd sort of try to analyse it. I got in the water sometimes before there was underwater cameras with goggles on, watching what was going on. We'd film stuff, we'd talk about it. So I'd have a role where I helped facilitate Scotty's program through trying to make sure his athletes didn't miss sessions. If they can not miss sessions, that's great. And then where can they improve performance? Again, in the early days, and sports science has evolved so much since I started. In the early days, there was no monitoring of speeds and acceleration patterns in swimming. You just had to kind of look at stroke rate and stroke count and sort of walk along the pool and measure how long each stroke was almost. And so you'd work out, where the hand position was best to get the best bang for buck, or what was the timing or sequence of kick and stroke and breaststroke that worked that out, or why Susie couldn't recover and fly well because she had a restriction thoracic spine. My role was in that squad was really deep, and we'd break down things and work out how to get more performance, but importantly, how to stop missing sessions.
You're obviously almost like a chameleon in terms of, I'm interpreting that correctly, like you just kind of see what was needed to let that athlete perform at their optimal level. Your ability, I'm sure it wasn't just making sandwiches. Maybe they're great sandwiches, but I feel like your ability to get a really good understanding of what was the limiting factors in that athlete actually being the best athlete they could possibly be. What makes those athletes so special, Vic? Like you've been around some of the best, so is it like, can you lay out like a top 3 or 5 things that you can just really sets that the best apart from just the good athletes?
I think the psychology of it and the capacity of them to work through things that are difficult. People that get handed stuff and don't have to go through adversity can still be good, but I think some of the greatest athletes have been through some sort of challenge or adversity and worked around that. And so the mindset of the athlete and their capacity to both handle adversity and handle work, but also to actually listen. The best athletes would listen to people and listen to the coach or the experienced athlete someone who mentored them. I think learning from that is important. And then the capacity to self-analyse. Robbie was an incredible self-analyst. He had these training sessions that he sort of built for himself, and he had a coach, but he did so much of his own stuff in his later career. And he would analyse each training session and what do I need to do, and he'd know how much he should race, how much he should do things. So this ability to self-analyse your performance rather than rely totally on other people. Like I would advise him, but he'd always make his own decision. I'd talk to Scotty and Susie would get involved, and she sometimes would put a foot down and say, I want to do this. So the capacity for an athlete to self-analyse and to have a strong mindset about what they're trying to do. And then it's the tedious dedication thing. You've got to put in the time, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to have a long view. That sort of process where an athlete looks towards the next Olympic cycle, not just the next national championships, or with Robbie it was Tour de France stages, and what did I have to do in the season leading up to that? So there was this capacity for great athletes that I've worked with to have that self-analysis and strong self-belief, and also the ability to listen and take advice at times, but also at times, they know themselves, they know what they're capable of. You know when to push, know when to hold back. Know when to fold them, know when to hold them. That Kenny Rogers song.
Mental resilience. Do you have to overcome adversity to build that character trait? Is that something that's just innate within these people to make them great? Or do you feel like that's a skill athletes can work on and people can help facilitate within them?
Any skill, any function, whether it be body, brain or mind, is always improvable. You can always train it. And again, it just happens to be that the athletes we're talking about, most of them had some sort of background adversity that they came through. So I guess it's in the people that I've worked with, that often sits there as something that happened rather than going to chase it and create adversity. Other than the adversity of hard training, how hard do you go in a session? Where is your limit? When should you push your limit? The coach teaches the athlete to be more resilient within the process of the training sessions. I remember Michael Bowl, who's one of Australia's best coaches, he used to have this thing, 100 hundreds. It was once a year.
Spicy.
His athletes would do 100 times 100 metres, and it was like it wasn't a physical session that had any value. In fact, it probably flattened them, but it was that capacity to stand up and do your 100, and he had certain time cycles and stuff. And I don't know if he still does it. Maybe he does. I've worked with Bowley for quite a few years. That's how he built the capacity to handle the adversity of that session. That session was a terrible session to endure, but if you got through that, you ended up with this understanding that I can do that. I've gotten over that adversity rather than it being a tragedy. It was really just a tough session, but I know I can do it. Good coaches have that capacity to find what it is to take an athlete past that. Other people, like Shane Watson, he broke down, he was done. So his adversity was, I can't play cricket anymore. I can't do what I'm good at and what I love, and I've still got years left. So his adversity was knuckling down and working through what was required to achieve that. Again, I've got so many memories of different athletes. Like working with the AFL, Michael Voss was running around on one leg for the last couple of years of his career and still producing extraordinary performances. Jason Ackermanis had a very troubled childhood, and his capacity to actually perform involved getting his head straight. And I had a bit of involvement with that at different times. Not as a professional psychologist. There was Phil Jauncey, who was really valuable in that Lions team. He had some personal challenges that maybe inhibited his capacity to perform, but maybe they gave him some strength as well. I don't psychoanalyse. As you find, when you're working closely with an athlete, you become a bit of an amateur psychologist in the sense that you engage with them and try to figure out how to nudge them where you want them to go. It's where I think the combination of the sports psych, the coach, the parent, the spouse, as you get into older athletes, all those people have such potential to influence the resilience of the athlete. You have the athletes crossing the line, looking to the sky. I'm nominating or I'm dedicating this performance to my recently departed father. Those things sometimes create a drive. Personal loss can create a drive, even though it's nothing that happened to them individually. In answer to your question, in a meandering sort of way, I think there's lots of different things that can make an athlete tougher and make an athlete more resilient. And sometimes we help them do that, you and I. Sometimes the coach does it. Sometimes it's life that does that. Taking advantage of those things. And a good coach will identify that and go, you know what, you really need to do this for your dad because he'd love to see this. And sometimes the athlete finds that extra little bit of drive or that little percentage extra of performance. It's the marginal gain of the emotive state that sometimes creates a fantastic performance.
Yeah, so it sounds like the 3 points were, adversity in some capacity to probably build resilience, good self-analytical mind, or having a good team around them that can help analyse, and then you said endure, but just kind of get the boring work done repeatedly, consistency over time. That sounds like the three things are all predicated on a good understanding of knowing themselves and what's driving their performance. Mate, I'm just sitting here and kind of, respecting the relationship you have with these people. And I've heard you say before, and when we're talking about mental game and strength, and you're spending this much time around people, something I've really noticed across my journey, and I'm only 10 years in the game, not 40, but the longer I operate, the more I realise the central nervous system and the mindset of these athletes really governs the adaptation they might experience in their training itself, the decisions they make on a daily basis. And then I've spoken with you about this before and heard you say it, like the central nervous system essentially drives the show. Can you elaborate on what you mean by, the central nervous system is the governor of these athletes and what that means as a clinician?
I'll grab it on for a bit about this because it's a real passion of mine. About 10 years ago, I had a client come in who wasn't an elite athlete and basically said, look, you didn't fix me, but this other bloke did. I want money back, that sort of conversation. And I sort of went, well, okay, that doesn't happen that often. Normally I get somewhere and I have this sort of mantra that if I can't fix you, I'll try to find someone that can, which is the network of professionals. But I also then did a bit of self-analysis and thought, look, where have I succeeded and failed with some of these athletes at times to create the outcome that I wanted? And then if it wasn't me, what was the limiting factor to that? And it was kind of funny, there was with Sam Riley at one stage, and I'd worked closely with Sam and Scotty, and she'd world records and won lots of medals, etc. And at one stage, Sam's performance was just crap in training, and she had a couple of bad meets, and Scotty and I were scratching our heads going, we've gone through the training diary, what have we done different? And she'd changed S&C coaches. It wasn't his fault necessarily. But I sort of identified the fact that her nervous system was probably fatigued. And I'd spoken or heard of this central nervous system fatigue thing at times. And I went, hang on, this is probably what's going on here. Like, there's a limiting factor to her capacity to both train and recover that's nervous system based, because physiologically, nutritionally, all the science nuts and bolts were together, but her nervous system was suppressed. And then I remembered a few conversations I'd had with Gennady Turetsky, who was a Russian swimming coach, incredible coach. Gennady's also passed away. I seem to be outliving some of the coaches I work with. And another funny story was Gennady was the AIS, and all Russians have had adversity. Very occasionally we'd sit there having long chats, and out of the bottom drawer would come the bottle of vodka, and we'd chat a bit more freely.
I can't imagine that happening anymore at the AIS.
No, that was a long time ago. That was in the 90s. And I remembered conversations with Gennady, they would do stuff to manipulate the emotional state of athletes. They very much believed in biorhythms. Okay, there's this term biorhythm. I don't know if people that are old like me will remember, you used to go to the pharmacy and there's a biorhythm machine that you'd hang on to a bit and it'd tell you about where you were in the biorhythm cycle. And he always said that humans operate on 10-day cycles. Training's done on 7-day weeks because that's the calendar. But he would push out to 10-day cycles. And we talked about what was the relevance of that. And he said his comments were always about that's how the nervous system operates. That's how the nervous system operates. And I remember these conversations. They didn't mean that much to me, or they meant something. Then I had the Sam thing with the central nervous system fatigue. Then I had the patient who I didn't fix. And so, hang on, there's this thing called the nervous system that is really important. So I dived down this rabbit hole. And again, with looking around corners, I stumbled across the Carrick Institute. There's a guy called Carrick who's a chiropractor in the States, and he created this model called functional neurology. It was a science that he created almost from scratch. And being a chiropractor, not taken seriously in Australia, but hugely respected in the US, okay, I sort of started looking at what the nervous system means. And his functional neurology looked at a normal structural brain, MRI scan, CT, your brain's normal, but something's not working properly. So there's some sort of connection, and then understanding the frontal lobe, the midbrain, the rear brain, and diving into that sort of system, you start to work out, hang on, this is what drives everything. Like, you cannot have a dysfunctioning nervous system and have a functioning athlete. And the nervous system, and you mentioned CNS, the whole nervous system consists of 3 parts: central nervous system, enteric nervous system, and autonomic nervous system. It's the nervous system that's the driver rather than the CNS on its own. And that's when I started going down this track of creating the NET program, Neural Engagement Therapy and Training, and talking about, well, what is it that we do that influences nervous system? What is an entry point into the system of the athlete. And is that fixing up their gut microbiome? Because neurotransmitters are produced in the gut, and hence my interest in functional medicine, because if you don't have a good neurotransmitter profile, you don't function well from a brain perspective. And then I stumbled onto this Kiwi guy called Grant Hayes, and Grant was this incredibly intelligent but somewhat maniacal practitioner who hadn't had much formal training, but he'd done all the Carrick stuff and the Eric Cobb stuff, which is all neural-based training. And he came over to Australia, did a course with us, and the knowledge that he had about the nervous system blew my mind. And that was another sort of deep dive into what does functional neurology mean? How does having a scar affect how you perform? Because the scar influences the input that the nervous system is getting, so it can influence the output. Tattoos, there was a thing that Grant would talk about where a couple of cricketers that were high profile, and I don't know them all, so I won't mention them, the worst statistical years in their career was when they got a sleeve tat, because that changes the very subtle information set that your brain is receiving, and that can change the output because it's an input change, So that sort of whole enteric nervous system, central nervous system, and then autonomic nervous system gets into play as well, and it's probably the most powerful driver, and that's where the autonomic nervous system, for those that aren't familiar with it, and everyone should be, I guess, but depends who's listening, is that part of your brain that controls all your automatic functions, your breathing, your heart rate, your pupil dilation, and lots of other functions, including fine-tuning coordination. That's all kind of related to this mid and rear brain function. And understanding that that's where problems can arise. And Grant, I'll fall back to him, he worked with F1 drivers and quite high-level people, improving their central nervous system and autonomic nervous system function using some basic brain training exercise. He now runs a company called Soma NPT, Neuro Performance Training, out of Switzerland. And he's got this gold standard now, and he works with a neuroscientist, gold standard cognitive function testing kit that's used at heaps of universities now, many across the world, some in Australia, to test cognitive function. And so when you're taking supplements or doing training programs to see the effect on cognitive function, it's measurable and it's trainable. Steph Curry, the basketballer, I remember seeing an article in New York Times about when he was at his last few parts of his career. He said, I stopped training my body, I just start training my brain. So that all those things kind of are very pertinent to the end result, and understanding that if you look at the nervous system and somehow monitor that effect of the nervous system, and if you can interfere in that in some shape or form to improve it, then you're going to improve everything else that the athlete's doing. Because, I've got the perspective now that that's the fundamental thing, that everything else is important too. But that's the thing, that if you get that wrong, no matter how much you do everything else, you're not going to do your best.
Let's say I'm a clinician listening and I'm like, yeah, Vic, I'm sold. I believe that the central nervous system is important, and I've had that same experience where a treatment with a client didn't go the way you wanted it to, and it's driven the thirst for more knowledge. And so I really respect the ability to kind of, admit when we're wrong and then try to get better as a clinician. So let's say I'm a clinician listening, this sounds relevant, it's triggering some light bulb moments for me. How do I assess the central nervous system, or how do I assess the nervous system, and what are some actionable things that they could do? There's a few ways that are very, easy to do, and one of them is looking at HRV, or heart rate variability. Maybe you can give me some advice. I was on 26% of recovery. My HRV, I've got 3 young kids, a few of them sick at the moment, so I was in the red, let's say. But yeah, sorry to derail, it's just front of mind. My HRV is poor with young kids. And that you're using a Whoop, right? Yeah, kind of. I went through a phase of using Aura Ring, Whoop, chest strap, and just for convenience, and the baseline. Yeah, good data. So I guess what you're saying is, my HRV's in the toilet, how do I get it better? And that's the fundamental thing that we want to find out. First, you've got to fall back a bit, and those that don't know what HRV is, heart rate variability, as measured, is the difference in the T-to-T wave. There's quite a complex formula around it. It's root mean square of the standard deviation of the T-to-T waves, RMSSD. And in layman terms? In layman terms, if you have everyone's seen the heart rate curves yes. on a trace. If your heart rate curve, every beat and every gap, and if they can put them on top of each other and they're symmetrical, you're in congestive cardiac failure. Not good. It's not good. Not good. Variability in the height, the speed, the distance of and we're talking about milliseconds, we're talking about small variations.
That's what heart rate variability is fundamentally. When you breathe in, your heart rate goes up. When you breathe out, your heart rate goes down slightly. And that's, again, a really important thing, because if your heart rate's not changing as you breathe, then there's something wrong with the system. There's another version of heart rate variability which we use to measure, which is orthostatic heart rate variability. So if I lie down and take my heart rate and it's 58, and I stand up and I take my heart rate and it's 62, my orthostatic heart rate variability is 4 beats.
What would be a good range there?
Under 10. Okay, 1, 2, 3, fantastic. Because what happens when you stand up, there's a stress on your system, which is gravity and different sensors fire off. If your body reacts to that stress in a negative way, as in your heart rate jumps, then there's something wrong with your capacity to handle stress. I'll use an example, I don't think you'll mind it. Jonathan Brown was one of the athletes I work with, and I'd finished up with the Lions and Vossi was coaching. And there's a famous story about Brownie being hit by a car while riding his bike, and they towed the car away. And it's true. It happened in the Gold Coast. He was living in the Currumbin Valley. Anyway, we checked his orthostatic HRV, and we were doing it with a chest strap, so we were trying to do it accurately. And the beat variation was like between 40 and 60. And we thought there must have been interference. We went outside and did it. It was like, you're kidding. Just the act of standing was considered as such a stress on his system that his heart rate jumped 40 beats. And we worked through that and used a few devices. And in the end, said, look, if your HRV is above 10, I want you to take it easy. If your orthostatic HRV variability is more than 15, don't train. So you can sort of look at the numbers and say they reflect the health of your nervous system.
So let's say you're outside of that range. Like, what does that mean for the athlete? How can I positively affect it?
What that means is there's something unhealthy about how your body's dealing with stress. This is where we delve into quite a deep area, but the autonomic nervous system, the part of your brain that controls all that, is affectionately referred to as your chimp brain or your reptilian brain. And when your chimp brain's telling you there's something wrong and there's danger, it will do things to stop you. It's hardwired to stop you. An extreme response is people who faint or freeze. Okay, so they're autonomic nervous system protective responses. For an athlete, if your autonomic nervous system is unhealthy, it can do stuff like it can put a brake on your heart rate. So if you're an endurance athlete and you're supposed to do a anaerobic tolerance set or something, or E3, E4 training, you're supposed to bang up into high 170s heart rate. But no matter how hard you try, you can't get it above 150. That's your autonomic nervous system putting a brake on your heart rate. So that's an example of how an athlete can be affected by a untoward HRV. HRV will go negative or will go bad into the red 3 or 4 days before you get sick. Often if your body's fighting off something. The HRV is incredibly sensitive. There's some research to suggest it's one of the first things that changes when you get cancer, that your HRV will be affected negatively. So as a tool, it's kind of really interesting and really valuable. And there is a lot of information around about that. Ben Grenfell does some pretty cool pods on HRV. And one of the uses, for example, is, one of the classic questions in strength and conditioning, how long do I take a rest between sets? Do I rest 30 seconds, a minute? Do I wait for my heart rate to recover? And with the chest strap, the Polar H10, pinging to your phone, there's a couple of apps. One's called HRV Logger, which gives you, RMSSD, all these different scientific measures. If you actually wait after a set for your HRV to recover to normal and then do your next set, that's one way of using it. And an athlete who has a lot of trouble in that space might choose to use HRV recovery as a gap between sets or a gap between exercises or a gap between efforts around the track. And that's interesting because it's actually measuring a neurophysiological response, not putting a time check on it. And there might be times where an athlete who's struggling to come back with a nervous system dysfunction should use HRV that way. How do I change it? So many ways. The cheapest, easiest way is breathing. As we mentioned, breathe in, heart rate goes up. That's sympathetic nervous system. Breathe out, heart rate goes down. That's parasympathetic. So if you're a bit oversympathetic, you just do some parasympathetic breathing. Breathe out longer than you breathe in, and gradually that drags you down. There's also the too quick, one slow out breathing technique, which again is a form of parasympathetic breathing.
Yeah, the physiological side. So effective, that exact breathing strategy, Vic. I think you initially kind of showed me that. athletes now in between intervals, that's the exact breathing strategy I try and give them. It's either the long, slow exhalations or the double in, long exhale. I've got data on myself and them of showing how much better your heart rate will recover in between intervals if you do a breathing strategy like that versus no awareness of breathing whatsoever in between reps. And of course, Brad and I, we work with a lot of endurance athletes. The story you just told of having a ceiling on heart rate, just can't hit the numbers they're meant to, is a very real one. And I think not everyone's a pro athlete and gets pro athlete hours. A lot of these guys are juggling real life stresses, full-time job, family, not being able to, kids, work, finance, whatever it might be. And so being aware when to push and when to pull back is so valuable because, if you don't, you end up running the risk of being injured or burning yourself out or just having really subpar performances, which outside of the financial implications for a professional athlete for these age groupers, it's a big knock on a big training block you've just put in. Mate, it sounds like there's some cool ways of measuring HRV, Whoop, or a chest strap, the orthostatic, heart rate variability, and then the ways of breathing you mentioned, longer exhales and inhales, the physiological side sounds like some really good ways. Going back to our first question around the nervous system as a whole, is there any other tools that you would use to get objective measures, or is there anything else you would use to calibrate where someone is at?
From a calibration point of view, the old traditional ice bath sauna thing. So Nordic countries have been using saunas forever as a way of making yourself healthier. And there's definitely influences on HRV with using saunas. And Wim Hof has popularised the use of ice baths. And both of those things have been around for a long time. And they both, used appropriately, the use of extreme heat and extreme cold is another way of modulating the nervous system and monitoring your response to that. So how much does getting in a cold bath spike my heart rate? And then over time, I'm jumping in there now, it's hardly changing. So you've developed a tolerance to that stress. So looking at your even raw heart rate responses to extreme heat and extreme cold can tell you how you're adapting to that process. And that's another way of monitoring whether things are changing. If you don't have a Whoop or an Oura ring, you can look at how you respond to a particular stress. The use of those tools can help improve that. So having a sauna a couple of times a week, having an ice bath regularly, those things help you do that, or help you get a healthier nervous system and a healthier autonomic nervous system. Again, they're not isolated to just nervous system. And this is the thing. So many things that we do have a nervous system influence. It's just understanding that actually exists. Rather than it being sets and reps and physiology, there's an underlying thing about that. What's my attitude to a training session? If I go to a training session not wanting to be there and not really caring and just going through the motions, am I getting a good outcome from that training session? Is my body going to accept that work? And so even attitudinal changes or cognitive thought process can influence a physiological outcome. Monitoring sleep is the other one. Sleeps are pretty easy on most of these. I don't have an Apple Watch. I'm a bit of a technophobe. But your sleep quality is a really good measure of what's going on. And if you take magnesium before you go to sleep and your sleep quality improves, that's a good thing. So you're changing a parameter that's a nervous system parameter. I do some consulting for a company called Plasmate, which is a sports performance supplement that's being used in triathlon world a fair bit at the moment. Christian and Gustav, whenever they jump on someone, most of the triathlon world knows about it. So but one of the interesting side effects of that is people that have got sleep apnea, because what it does is it triggers nitric oxide production, and nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It triggers endogenous nitric oxide production. So if you take it before you go to sleep and you get sleep apnea events, it'll actually stop the apnea event because you've got higher blood flow to the brain. And so improving sleep quality with mechanisms like that improves your recovery, because we all know sleep's, it's one of the things that we don't know you should. Sleep's one of the most important things you can do as an athlete to get right. And with 3 kids now, you're suffering from that, which is why your HRV's in the toilet.
Sometimes you just still got to get the work done anyway, Vic.
But that's that one thing on its own. Just sleep deprivation is enough to create a significant nervous system degradation, for want of a better term. And then it's supporting that. It's nutritional support, make sure my gut health's good. use supplements like magnesium, plasmate, other bits and pieces. Like, how do I supplement my physiology to keep it robust whilst my nervous system's under duress? You know, I don't consider myself a nutritional expert by any means, but I've worked with great people in that space, and there are things that are pretty stock standard that most athletes consider now. You know, taking magnesium is one of those things because you sweat it out, and you can use sweat patches and get the physiology of that right. So that's what I was talking about, sports science. There's so many ways now an athlete can improve themselves, and even the age group is like, there's so much option. Where do I go? You know, what do I do? And that's where guys like yourself and Brad and me have a role. We go, okay, this is what I think you should do. You go and see Hugh and he'll talk to you about that. You know, I'll help you with this part of it. And so that team dynamic is and utilising different tools helps people. I mean, I mentioned acupuncture. Acupuncture is a 3,000-year-old health tool. And if it didn't work, it wouldn't be around. And I have great people like Alan Jansen I work with who can turn someone on and off using acupuncture, and it's a nervous system influence. So, you know, the exact mechanism of that is debatable, but Al will tell you about your yin and your yang and your heat in your liver and your kidney, and he'll put needles in your ear and things will change. You know, I don't profess to understand it, but I believe it has an influence. So that's another tool that I find athletes that are struggling with nervous system things. I'll recommend acupuncture as a tool. And it's different than dry needling. Dry needling, sticking a needle in a tight trigger point, that's got value, but that's not what I'm talking about with nervous system modulation. It's proper traditional based acupuncture and stuff like that can help.
I mean, super valuable, and it sounds like the ways of objectively kind of getting insight, HRV data, measuring your response to, you know, something as basic as just changing your position, through to, you know, hot and cold exposure, which is, you know, inherently a more stressful stimulus to the body, and then sleep, which potentially could be the most important and governs a lot of these other factors. But I feel like if, you know, people are doing those three things and measuring those things just as a baseline, you can start to make some really cool changes. And I think just the value of measuring alone, bringing awareness to these things is so powerful. On the other column here, it sounds like, you know, the ways that we can positively affect that is, you know, again, the hot and the cold as a tool for objectively measuring, but also then changing our resilience to stress. And, you know, there's something about purposely putting yourself into uncomfortable environments, which actually athletes do all the time, but sometimes not having that physical element of training hard, hot or cold, is another way of applying a stress to the body. And then, you know, nutrition, getting that right, making sure our neurotransmitter profile is right. And, you know, I've had examples where, you know, it might be as simple as athletes just not getting enough protein in. They get their protein, their resting heart rate drops back to a normal range. Or, you know, they've got food intolerances and they're eating stuff that, you know, heavily inflames their gut to the point where their core won't switch on, and then they're getting back and hip stuff going on as well. So it sounds like, you know, dialing in nutrition, dialing in sleep, and dialing in these things are, you know, great ways that people at home could identify and kind of implement with some of their people, obviously within the scope of practice. And if it's outside of what they feel comfortable, like you were saying, having that network of people that you really trust and can rely on, I think is obviously what's made you so successful over the years, being that person who can probably be the satellite and kind of step in and out of a lot of those roles as you're going as well. Seems to be what, you know, these athletes value so heavily. Is there anything else that you wish I've asked you about, you know, the central or the nervous system in a whole that we kind of haven't touched on yet? And, you know, the net training, that neural engagement training and techniques, which I've had some exposure to, and, you know, the eye training and, you know, the feet and all this stuff.
Yeah, there's lots that we can't talk about at the time that we have, and that's why I created the neural engagement therapy and training. There's a website, netglobal.com.au, and I'm doing some education in that space now. So I'm hooking up with an extremely talented physio, Dr. Joe Brown, sprint doctor, works with Noel Lyles and co, and Joey Hayes, who's a S&C at the coast here. We're doing a one-day course in the end of August at Total Fusion. You've been to Total Fusion, we spoke of that. It's a gym that has all the things that you need, including LED red light therapy and different temperature spas and saunas. It's a fascinating place to work out of, and I'll be working out of there as of September. That sort of ability to integrate with someone like Joe or Joey or with yourself who's got tools and things that you do, and then go, look, how do we do that better? You know, what is the core part, like if you've got really poor foot connection with the ground, and there's so many drills you can do to improve that. Is that the starting point? Does my poor connection and my overpronation, does it need an orthotic? Or does it need cerebellar training? Because I've got a weak left cerebellum. So that dive into assessing cerebellar function, assessing, the pronation and how do I change that? Do I do foot exercises to do that, or is it actually coming from a hip internally rotating? I don't want to sort of focus on saying, well, the nervous system's everything. I think it's the overriding thing that controls stuff, but that doesn't deride or detract from the importance of biomechanics. If I don't have good hip internal rotation, what does that do if I'm a cyclist? My knee's coming out from the top tube. That's going to give me some problems. So I think I didn't want to get the impression that it's all about the nervous system. I think the understanding of good sports biomechanics, good sports training process, good nutrition, good structure, good flexibility. Do you use yoga or do you use stretching? Do you do hot yoga? There's all those other elements that you can put together. The challenge from a professional athlete's point of view is, I've got so much time in a day, what do I do? And that's where the coach and the team around them comes into play. For the age grouper, it's, I've got to work, I've got to feed the family, I've got to find 20 hours a week to train. Where the hell am I going to find time to recover? Or do all this stuff you're talking about? And that's the challenge, where you just have to work out, what of this matters to you? What of this can I influence? And what are my mechanisms for learning more about it? And as I mentioned, I'm trying to get into that education space for professionals now, because I think after 40 years, it's time for me to try to give that back to some degree. And that's what I'm trying to do. It's understanding what else is out there. Who else can I talk to? Who else can I see? So as a professional, and this sort of stuff, the podcasts are a huge part of professional learning now, like Huberman and guys like that talk about a whole lot of stuff, and even Joe Rogan sometimes delves into stuff that, that's really interesting. How does that apply to sport? And it does. So there's so much information out there. It's almost information overload. And sometimes like getting a channel or getting a structure or something you can go to actually get some important pieces and put them together. And that's why I created the NET program. It's just an online available resource for professionals to go to and learn about this stuff.
And that's something I'm selfishly very excited about, and we'll put some links and stuff in the show notes so people can find out. And just to read out, like Dr. Joe Brown, like Noah Lyles, the fastest man in the world, physio, Joey Hayes, pro builder, and we've heard your vast experience with the athletes. What would you say to an up-and-coming professional would be like your top three things? Look, I aspire to have your career, Vic. You've worked with all these people, these awesome organisations. Like, what are three things you would say to that upcoming clinician to get to where you are today, or get to work with the pro athletes?
The minute you think you know everything, you're finished. Okay? I'll often say I'll have an opinion on everything, but someone can convince me otherwise. It's this ability to go broadly about understanding, and don't get chucked in a silo of, I'm a physio, and physios are the only professionals that are any good. And sometimes that happens. So working with other professionals, getting a team around you, or getting a network of people who you're prepared to refer to. The capacity to refer is really important. I think that's one of the things. The other is to broaden your education base. I used to do, when I was in Sydney, and this is before the days of a lot of education, I used to do massage courses, and I went to an osteopathic course, and because there's nothing much in physio. And so I'd find out information from other professionals. Go to a podiatrist and say, hey, can I sit in? Learn about the other elements of in the sports world, learn about the other elements of what's out there. Dr. Sue Jackson, who I work with a bit, she's really cool in flow state, and looking at Sue's book and figuring out what flow state is and how you get that. And what is flow state? Is that a mental space, a physical space? So understand what you don't know, be prepared to refer, and be prepared to self-educate. I guess they're the sort of three. If I'm trying to keep it to three, they're the three big ones. Get out there and sorry, I've got to give you the fourth. Respect the coach. The coach knows a lot. Understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what they see. Great coaches are an incredible resource as any practitioner, because they might not be scientific, but they apply it. And then sometimes you work out what that application came from, and then you go, okay, well, I can help that. And that's our role.
Yeah, I mean, super valuable stuff, man. And I think a lot of learnings come from, making big mistakes in probably each of those columns as you come through, and that's where you learn the most, in my experience as well. And the last one you said there, respecting the coach. It's so funny, as a young clinician, you feel like you know better than the coach until you step into their world and look at their vast experience of coaching that maybe just that one athlete for 20 years, and within the sport for 40, 50, 60 years. We mentioned at the start, Robbie McEwen, obviously one of Australia's best cyclists, and a guy who, in his book, One Way Road, actually has a whole chapter called Victor, devoted to you, which, two things, like, how does that make you feel?
I'm proud to have helped him. I feel like I've achieved something with an athlete, and I know, and he'd say it to me, man, I just win more races when you're around. I get goosebumps when I think about
I can feel the emotion.
Some of those stage wins, that he did. There was some of the epic things that he did. It's like Stuart Grady as well, fractured his collarbone in 3 places, Giro d'Italia, in May, and had to ride the Olympics in Atlanta. I ended up flying over to his place in Toulouse, and there's a great photo of me drinking a Corona while he's swimming laps with his post-collarbone thing. Helping those guys achieve stuff, because they're so good and they're so tough. Helping Sam to a world record, helping Scotty, help Susie get, I just have this real buzz from helping people achieve their best. I mean, I was a crap athlete. I used to love sport, but I was never any good at it. I was never going to be at a high level. But certainly I get a buzz from doing that. I get really this warm, fuzzy feeling from sitting next to Sam Riley's mum when she made her first Olympic team, and giving Lenny a big hug, and those things like that, I tear up. It's some of the memories that I've had with athletes. When Watto won his first Alan Border medal, and I was sitting in the crowd and he thanked me, and I'm in Richie Benno's book apparently as well. My kids now get to, Dad, you're in this book. Oh yeah, I remember doing that. So I just have this immense pride, and I feel grateful. It's a funny overused term. I feel grateful that these guys trusted me. Okay, they trusted me with their bodies and their careers, and I was able to deliver, if it wasn't with my own skill set, by saying, hey, you need to go see Al, you need to go do this, you need to go see this guy, you need to go see this doctor. I mean, I work with some great docs, people that would inject things on a Sunday. You'd give them a call, can you help me out? And so that feeling of achievement and assisting these guys achieve what they want to achieve has always been a driver. Sitting on the MCG for 3 and 4 grand finals, and 3 of them we won, and watching Lee Matthews do his thing. Like, I'm in awe of Lee, still am, and a lot of guys coaching at AFL level now were under Lee. And so just watching that in action and being part of that in some form has been the buzz and the driver for me being involved in sport and loving it.
I'm sure you could recount endless stories, but there's one here where I believe he kind of says something colourful to you as he's won another stage, and would you mind sharing that story? Because I've actually, it's for anyone who hasn't, it's quite any allied health professional to have a chapter written after him. It's pretty awesome, mate. So,
but I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact circumstance, but there's some good ones with Robbie.
I think his friend hit you also. He mentions and punched you on the way through. We've done it again, you son of a bitch, or something to that effect.
I mean, he would love it. I'll tell you one story though, that it was one of the tours, 2004, and he was leading into Athens Olympics, and Robbie had won a few stages, and he had a massive crash, like bike broke. He was near the finish line. It wasn't his fault. Anyway, after listening to him scream as he scrubbed all the gravel out of his body, and my back sore, and we sort of put him back together and literally put him on the bike in the mornings for days. And after a few days, I could kind of actually get in and do a bit. And I was spending a couple of hours a night on him, getting him ready. And after a few days, he says, "What do you think's wrong with me? What do you think I've done? My back's killing me." Well, I said, I think you fractured transverse process. And he said, "Well, do I get x-rays?" I said, "No, you don't want to know. Like, if you have, you have. Well, does it make me stop? Is it dangerous?" I said, not really. I've had Justin Lepich play 2 games with a fractured transverse process before he worked out what it was. That was our mistake. So he said, "All right, let's get through the tour." And he just made it. Literally, and one more day he was done. And he won the green jersey, and there's a lot of upside from that. I still own a bike that Eddie Merckx gave me, by the way, from that tour. Awesome. Anyway, I'm sitting on the beach in Monaco, because after the tour I'd helped Baden Cook and Brad McGee out a bit, and Baden gave me keys to his Monaco apartment because he was going somewhere else. So I'm sitting on the beach with my wife Nicole, and the phone rings, and it's Robbie. And I'm like, my back's still really sore. "Have you had an x-ray?" No, I've got a couple more crits I've got to race. I get paid a lot of money to race these post-tour crits. "Go and get it done. You've got the Olympics in like a month. Go and do it." I get the phone call the next day. I'm lying on the beach in Monaco again. "Mate, you're wrong." I went, "That didn't happen often." I didn't fracture one transverse process, I fractured two. And that goes to the resilience of that sort of athlete. And I think he went on and raced in Athens after knowing what was wrong with him. But I've got plenty of those sort of stories and for another time.
Mainly endurance athletes and athletes, just to endure pain, to have literally a broken back and get back on the bike.
And win a green jersey.
Crazy, mate. It's such I'm sure we could sit here and recount stories all day, and I gladly would. If you could distill everything from your whole career up until this point down into one piece of advice for the listener to perform at their physical best, what would that be?
Believe in yourself and the people around you. That belief is important. If you doubt yourself and you doubt the people around you, the doubt expresses in an inability to perform, is what I've seen. And so that's kind of the one piece. And the second piece, because we're going to chuck in another one, I think it was Linford Christie that said, the athletes that are most successful are the ones that can train the longest without injury. And that quote is really important for us and for all the practitioners listening. The athlete that can train the longest without injury will perform the best. And that's the other thing I'd sort of look at it. How do you do that?
Magic pieces of advice, man. That's our role, isn't it? Keep them out there doing their thing for as long as they can. Brad, obviously, when I mentioned that you were coming on the show, he shared how much he admired you as a clinician, and this is his book, so obviously he's read the chapter, and he actually recounted when you treated him as a young up-and-coming triathlete. He said, to the exact words, while Vic was sitting there with his elbow in my TFL, I was looking up at him going, I want to be this guy one day. And so he was sad he couldn't be on today's show, but what part of the tradition of the show is to give our listeners of the show a challenge. So what's Victor Popov's one physical challenge or mental, whatever you choose, to elicit the listener to try and do
something better for themselves?
Mate, it's your challenge. Yeah.
If you haven't done an ice baths, okay, it's such a powerful tool. Go listen to Wim Hof podcast if you need to and do the breathing stuff, but be able to get in the ice bath for 90 seconds and then 4 minutes and then 12 minutes if you can. That's such a powerful thing to do, to be able to get yourself. So if you're not an ice bath person, give that a crack.
Awesome. So ice bath, is there a time limit, or it's just get in there and try it? What are we aiming for?
My belief is that there's three parameters. There's a 90-second one, then there's a 4-minute one, and there's a 12-minute one. You don't need more than that. So if you can get 90 seconds, be able to do that, get in and out, and then go for 4 minutes, then go for 12 minutes. If you're doing 12 minutes, you're done. And it's got to be under 10 degrees, though. None of this 14-degree ice bath stuff. You've got to be under 10.
Perfect, Jane. So that's Victor Popov's challenge to the listener is jump in an ice bath. We mentioned it briefly before, but just again for the listeners, this is your chance just to kind of, where can they go to read more about yourself? I know you've got that upcoming seminar.
The upcoming seminar, performance-based practice. And it's with Joe Brown and Joe has myself. It's at August 30 at Total Fusion, and there's on either Joey's Ultimate Sports Performance or my Victor Popov Physio website, or on some of the socials you'll find it.
We'll drop a link for that, man, in the show notes as well.
And certainly NETT, Neural Engagement Therapy and Training, there's a series of, there's a foundation course and advanced course. There's one interesting, and I didn't touch on this because we can't touch on everything, the use of neurogenic tremor as a tool to improve your nervous system health. And there's a course down the bottom right of the page written by a guy called Richmond Heath, which is a fantastic introduction to that tool. So yeah, they're sort of places you can go, and I'll expand on that. There's going to be a neural engagement for kids, a paediatric one done by Kelly Youssef will go on shortly. And it's the use of neural engagement techniques in occupational therapy in kids. So that's the place to go.
Mate, I just want to say I'm super grateful for getting the chance to work with you across the last decade of me being an allied health professional, and I highly recommend the listeners getting involved, checking out the seminar. I know I'll be going along personally, so just wanted to say thank you for jumping on the show.
Mate, thanks to you, and thanks to Brad. I'm glad you got, you're probably better than I am now, Brad.
Thank you, mate.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust that you enjoyed today's sharings from Victor Popov. Don't forget, upcoming in the next week or two, Victor will co-host a high-performance seminar along with Joe Brown and strength and conditioning coach Joey Hayes in Brisbane. Jump over to ultimatesportsperformance.com.au to find out more. A massive thank you to the good folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, audio engineer, Susan Wilkins, show administration, Matthew Olding, show graphic design, and videographer Kalen. To find our archived episodes, jump over to physicalperformanceshow.com, and there you can peruse the archives dating right back to Ironman Surf Lifesaving Champion Ali Day on episode 1. To follow the show on socials, jump over to @PhysicalPerformanceShow, and you'll also find myself @Brud_beer and co-host Hugh Darnell at Hugh, HUWDARNELL. Now, coming up on next week's expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, I caught up with PhD scholar Dr. Jen Hamer for an exploration around low energy availability amongst developing athletes. It's what I'd say is a crucial conversation for stakeholders in sport, with topics discussed being that of body image dissatisfaction, physique considerations in high performance sport. And Jen outlines the required culture shift in order to promote positive body ideals and hopefully help athletes avoid the pitfall of underfueling and the sequelae that can go with that, such as relative energy deficiency in sport. It's a massive episode, so be sure to be tuning in next week to episode 370 of the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. This has been Brad Beer and Hugh Darnell for the Physical Performance Show.